For 20 years, you saw my life through a lens that was never mine. You saw the smiles, the matching outfits, and a version of faith that I was told would protect me from the world. But while the cameras were rolling on 19 kids and counting, I was living in a quiet, constant state of fear, afraid that one wrong thought or one tiny mistake would pull me out from under a divine umbrella. I didn't yet understand. I've spent the last few years unthreading the harmful teachings of my youth and finally learning to breathe without asking for permission. Tonight, I'm not following a script. I'm not performing for an audience. I'm simply telling the truth about what it was really like to be a Duggar and how I finally became free indeed. This is my full story from the very beginning. That big house in Tontitown, Arkansas, was my entire world. To anyone looking in from the outside, it looked like a sanctuary, a place where 19 siblings lived in perfect, smiling harmony. But for me, those walls were a filter that kept the rest of the world out. Growing up Duggar meant living in a bubble where every thought was monitored and every action was measured against a standard of perfection I didn't yet realize was impossible to reach. My childhood was defined by industrial, sized pots of food, rigid schedules, and a belief system that taught me that asking why was the first step toward spiritual ruin. We were told the world outside our gates was a dark, dangerous place filled with people who didn't love God the way we did. I didn't know how other people, their lives, or how they lived their lives. Every day was a performance for the cameras that followed us. But behind that smile, there was a little girl wondering if I ever step outside this bubble, will God still love me? That fear was the very foundation of my upbringing. To understand my family, you have to understand the man whose teachings governed every second of our lives, Bill Gothard. His organization, the IBLP, provided the blueprint for our existence. My parents truly believed that following Gothard's basic life principles was the only way to ensure we stayed on the path of righteousness. But in reality, those principles were a complex web of control. We weren't taught about a God of grace. We were taught about a God who was more like a cosmic policeman, waiting for us to slip up. We couldn't listen to certain music. We couldn't watch TV. And even our clothes were designed to be a shield against worldly influences. We were told that if we strayed from these rules, we were opening our lives to the devil. Every night, I would lay in my bed and replay my day, terrified that I had committed some small infraction that would bring judgment upon me. Gothard's doctrine didn't teach us how to love. It taught us how to fear. And it turned our faith into a list of chores and prohibitions. Fear wasn't just a part of our religion. It was the foundation of our family dynamic. We were taught about the umbrella of authority, a hierarchy where God spoke to my father spoke to my mother, and they spoke to us. Was that if you stepped out from under that umbrella by being disobedient or rebellious, you were told you were unprotected from Satan's power. This belief turned me into a lifelong people pleaser. I was constantly seeking my father's approval because in my mind, his approval was the only way to know I was okay with God. I remember the paralyzing anxiety of thinking I might have an unauthorized thought. This kind of fear strips away your ability to trust your own conscience or your own mind. You become a shell waiting for someone else to tell you what is right and what is wrong. It wasn't about safety. It was about total psychological submission. That umbrella wasn't there to protect us. It was there to keep us in the dark. In the Duggar house, being a daughter meant becoming a mother before you were even a teenager. The buddy system was presented on TV as a cute way for older kids to help the younger ones. But the truth was much heavier. It was parentification. Jana, Jill, Jessa, and I weren't just sisters. We were sister moms while I was still a child myself. I was responsible for the physical and emotional needs of several younger siblings. I look back and I see how exhausted we were. We were changing diapers, managing homeschooling, and disciplining toddlers while our own childhoods were slipping through our fingers. We were taught that self-sacrifice was the highest calling for a woman, but we weren't being taught how to be mothers. We were being taught how to be cogs in a machine. My mother was constantly having more children, and the older we got, the more the burden shifted to our shoulders. When I see my own daughters now playing and just being little girls, it breaks my heart to realize how much of that joy was replaced by duty in my own life. Then there were the cameras. Our lives became a global brand through 19 Kids and counting. But what the world saw was a carefully edited reality. We were trained to be joyfully available at all times, which meant that no matter how tired, sad, or frustrated we were, we had to keep smiling for the production crew. The cameras acted as a secondary form of surveillance. We knew we were representing our faith to millions. So the pressure to be perfect was immense. We learned to speak in sound bites and to hide the cracks in our family foundation. The red light on the camera meant it was time to perform. It prevented us from ever having a real private conversation about the things that were bothering us. If it wasn't wholesome, it didn't make the cut. Reality TV made us famous, but it also made us strangers to ourselves. We weren't living a life. We were producing a show, and the cost of that performance was our honesty. For a long time, the way I dressed was the most visible sign of my obedience. In our world, modesty wasn't just about being humble. It was a rigid set of rules designed to protect men from their own thoughts. We were taught that a woman's body was a potential stumbling block for every man who saw her. This meant long skirts, high necklines, and layers, even in the heat of an Arkansas summer. But the real prison wasn't the fabric. It was the mindset. Every time I looked in the mirror, I wasn't seeing myself. I was seeing a liability. I was taught that if a man looked at me the wrong way, it was my fault for not being modest enough. It creates a deep sense of shame about your own body. Moving to Los Angeles and wearing pants for the first time wasn't about fashion. It was about realizing that my worth isn't defined by the length of my skirt. It was about breaking the idea that I am responsible for someone else's purity. Though there were things happening behind the scenes that never made it to the TV screen, at least not at first. When the first signs of trouble appeared within our family, the instinct wasn't to seek professional help or involve the authorities. The instinct was to protect the ministry and the brand. We were taught that washing our dirty laundry in public was a sin against the family and against God. I remember the whispered conversations and the feeling that something was very wrong, but being told to keep sweet and keep moving forward. This culture of secrecy is what allows rot to grow. When you prioritize the image of a perfect Christian family over the safety and healing of the individuals within it, you create a dangerous environment. It took me years to realize that the protection we were offered was actually a form of silencing. True healing can't happen in the dark. It requires the light of the truth, no matter how uncomfortable that truth might be. The concept of the umbrella of authority was the most powerful tool of control in our lives. It's a very simple diagram: God at the top, then the husband, then the wife, then the children. As long as you stayed under that umbrella, you were safe. But if you questioned a decision or wanted to make a choice for yourself, you were told you were stepping out into the reign of Satan's influence. This hierarchy meant that my father's word was essentially God's word for me. There was no room for personal conviction if it contradicted the head of the household. It made it impossible to grow into an independent adult. You were always a child, always waiting for permission. Even as a grown woman, I felt I couldn't breathe or act without checking the umbrella. It wasn't until I began to study the Bible for myself, outside of the IBLP filters, that I realized God wants a direct relationship with me, not one that has to go through a human intermediary. The daughters in the family, our primary job was to be quiet, submissive, and joyfully available. We were raised to believe that having a strong opinion or a differing view was a sign of a rebellious spirit. If we were unhappy, we were told to pray more. If we were tired, we were told to serve more. Our voices were essentially tuned out in favor of the family goals. I look back at old footage of myself and I see a girl who is carefully choosing every word to make sure it fits the narrative. We were experts at saying a lot without saying anything at all. This silence wasn't just about what we didn't say to the cameras. It was what we didn't even say to each other. We were all living in the same house, but we were often isolated in our own fears. Breaking that silence was the scariest thing I've ever done, but it was also the only way to save my life. I was a world-class people pleaser in a system built on performance and obedience. Your only sense of security comes from the approval of those in charge. I spent every waking hour trying to make sure my parents were happy with me, that the viewers liked me, and that I was following every tiny rule of the IBLP. I thought that was what it meant to be a good Christian. The problem with seeking approval is that you lose yourself in the process. You stop knowing what you actually like, what you actually think, or who you actually are. I was so afraid of disappointing people that I was willing to sacrifice my own mental health and my own peace. It took a long time to realize that God's love isn't something I have to earn through a perfect performance. Learning to say no and learning that it's okay if someone is unhappy with my choices was a massive turning point in my journey toward freedom. Meeting Jeremy was like the first time a different way to live out faith. He was a pastor. He loved God, but he didn't follow the rules of the IBLP. For the first time, someone was encouraging me to look at the Bible for what it actually said, not through the lens of a checklist or a man-made doctrine. Jeremy challenged my views, but he did it with a kindness that I wasn't used to when it came to questioning authority. I remember the fear I felt when I realized I was falling in love with someone who didn't fit my father's perfect a courtship mold. It was the first time I felt a crack in the foundation of the world I had been built in. Jeremy showed me that you could be a person of deep faith and still have a personality, still have opinions, and still enjoy life without the constant weight of legalism. He didn't just want to be my head of household. He wanted to be my partner. That shift in perspective changed everything for me. Moving from Laredo to Los Angeles felt like moving to another planet. In Tontitown, everything was predictable and controlled, but LA was loud, diverse, and unapologetically itself. For the first time in my life, I was just Jinger. I wasn't part of a giant family brand, and people didn't know or care about my modesty rules or my family's TV show. The culture shock was intense, but it was also incredibly healing. I started to see the beauty in people who were completely different from me. People I had been taught to fear or pity. Living in such a vibrant city forced me to step out of my comfort zone and truly decide what I believed for myself. I started wearing pants, not to be rebellious, but because I realized that God cares more about my heart than my outfit. LA gave me the space to breathe and the freedom to finally start discovering who Jinger really was when the cameras stopped rolling. People often use the word deconstruction when they talk about leaving a strict religious background, leaving a religious background, but I prefer the word disentangling. I wasn't trying to tear down my faith. I was trying to pull out the toxic threads of Gothard's teachings that had become twisted around the truth of the gospel. It was a painful, slow process of looking at every belief I held and asking, is this from the Bible? Or is this from a man who wanted control? Disentangling means realizing that the fear, the shame, and the rules were not from God. It means keeping the core of who I am and my love for Christ while letting go of the umbrella of authority and the performance-based religion I was raised with. It's a terrifying journey because you feel like you're losing your identity. But on the other side, I found a faith that is actually based on grace, not works. I didn't lose my God. I lost the prison I thought was his house. For a long time, the public didn't know the truth about the money behind the show. We were working full-time jobs as reality TV stars, but many of us didn't have access to the earnings. The financial control was just another layer of the umbrella of authority. When you don't have financial independence, it's much harder to make independent choices for your life. seeing my sister Jill and her husband Derek have to fight for their fair share was a wake up call for many of us. It wasn't about greed. It was about the right to provide for our own families and to not be tethered to a system that used money as a leash. When you grow up in a world where the father controls the bank account, the career path, and the spiritual path, you aren't an adult, you're an asset. Breaking those financial chains was a crucial step in truly becoming an independent person, but it came with a heavy cost to our family relationships. In 2021, our family was forced to face a reality that could no longer be prayed away or hidden by a TV edit. The arrest and trial of my older brother, Josh, was the most devastating moment our family has ever faced. For years, the focus had been on healing and forgiveness, but the trial brought the horrific truth into the light in a way that was impossible to ignore. Watching the fallout from that trial was like watching the world I grew up in finally collapse. It forced a reckoning with the culture of secrecy that had protected him for so long. My heart broke for the victims, and I had to reconcile the brother I knew with the person who had committed these unthinkable crimes. It was a time of deep grief, but also of clarity. It confirmed that the system we were raised in, the one that prioritized the family image over everything else, was fundamentally broken. The truth was painful, but the truth was necessary. When I became a mother to my own daughters, I realized just how much my perspective on parenting had to change. In the world I grew up in, children were often seen as arrows to be shot into a spiritual war or cogs in a larger family machine. Looking into my daughter's eyes, I knew I wanted something different for them. I didn't want them to grow up fearing that their thoughts were sinful or that their worth was tied to their performance. I am raising them to know that God's love is a gift, not a wage to be earned. We don't have sister moms in our house. We have sisters who get to be children. I want them to have voices, to ask questions, and to know that their boundaries are respected. I'm learning that being a good mother isn't about control. It's about providing a safe space for them to become exactly who God created them to be. My daughters will never know the umbrella of authority, but they will know they are loved unconditionally. One of the hardest parts of disentangling is the loneliness that comes with it. When you leave a tight knit community like the IBLP, you don't just leave a set of rules. You often lose your entire social support system. I've felt the sting of being looked at differently by people I've known my whole life. There is a specific kind of grief in knowing that some family members view my freedom as a betrayal. The shunning isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just the silence, the invitations that don't come, the group chats you're no longer a part of. It's the price of honesty. But as painful as that loss is, I've realized that a community built on shared fear isn't a true community at all. I've had to build a new family of choice. Friends and mentors who love me for who I am, not for how well I follow a script. The loss was heavy, but the gain of authentic connection has been worth every tear. For years, I thought the Bible was a book of no. No to this music, no to those clothes, no to that friendship. But as I began to study the scriptures without the IBLP filters, I found a very different message. I found a Christ who went toward the outcasts, who challenged the legalists of his day, and who offered rest to the weary. I realized that so many of the convictions I was raised with were actually just man-made traditions disguised as divine commands. The Bible isn't a checklist. It's a story of redemption. Learning the difference between legalism and a grace was like seeing in color for the first time. I no longer feel the need to perform for God's favor. I'm learning that true holiness isn't about what you wear or what you don't do. It's about the transformation of your heart. I traded a life of thou shalt nots for a life of eat is finished. And in that truth, I finally found peace. People often ask me if I've forgiven my parents. Forgiveness is a journey, and for me, it's about letting go of the bitterness that could easily consume me. I love my family, and I always will. But I've also learned that forgiveness does not mean an absence of boundaries. You can forgive someone while still deciding that they don't get to have a front row seat in your life if they continue to uphold harmful systems. Boundaries are not a lack of love. They are a form of self-respect. I had to learn that it's okay to say no to family gatherings that are toxic or to conversations that attempt to pull me back into fear. I am choosing to protect my peace and the peace of my own little family. It's a difficult balance to walk. Loving from a distance. But it's the only way to remain healthy. I'm not running away. I'm walking toward a life built on truth, and I'm taking only what is healthy with me. We've come to the end of this journey, but for many of you listening, your journey might just be beginning. If you feel trapped in a system that tells you God is a monster and you are nothing, please hear me. You are not alone, and there is hope. The walls of legalism are high, but they are not unbreakable. You don't have to live in fear of your own shadow. Becoming freed, indeed, isn't about doing whatever you want. It's about having the freedom to do what is right and true without being coerced by shame. My life is very different now than it was in Tontitown, and while it isn't perfect, it is honest. I am no longer a character in a show. I am a woman, a wife, a mother, and a follower of Christ who is finally living with her eyes wide open. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it helps you find the courage to tell your own. I'm Jinger Duggar, Vuolo, and the truth has finally set me free.